What is entrepreneurial intelligence? Will it be replaced by artificial intelligence? Steven Phelan has the answers.
This is the Economics for Entrepreneurs podcast, a project of the Mises Institute, applying the principles of economics to start, grow, and manage your business. For free tools, resources, key takeaways, and actionable insights from each episode, visit Mises.org/E4EPod. Now, here's Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. We hear a lot about artificial intelligence these days. What we hear are great promises, that it will provide cognitive augmentation for both people and the computing systems that support us. On the other hand, there's the fear that it will eliminate jobs, although that's been a fear of technology repeated throughout history that has never come to pass. Our concern is specifically with entrepreneurs in business and the entrepreneurial business process of identifying customer needs accurately and designing some new and better product or service or communication to meet those needs in better ways, thus creating value. Those needs are emotional, idiosyncratic, and variable. They result from individual consumers each selecting their own ends and searching for the means to attain them. This is all subjective, inside the customer's mind. It's psychologic, as our friend Rory Sutherland calls it. Can artificial intelligence help entrepreneurs in this realm? Or is there another kind of intelligence that's more adapted to this task? Steven Phelan believes there is. And he undertook a deep review of the potential of artificial intelligence in the realm of the entrepreneur, and in doing so, he actually defined a new, different, and more applicable form of intelligence. He calls it entrepreneurial intelligence. This intelligence pursues empathic accuracy in the realm of business, the indispensable ingredient for business success in customer-centric systems. He's been able to identify the key elements of this special intelligence and can help us with both assessing it and nurturing it. Steven is a researcher and a teacher in the field of entrepreneurship and has conducted significant original research in the area of artificial intelligence. He's an expert on the application of AI in entrepreneurship. Steven is Distinguished Professor of Entrepreneurship at Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he teaches MBA courses in entrepreneurial strategy and finance, business growth strategies, and new venture creation. Steve, welcome back to Economics for Entrepreneurs.
Thanks, Hunter. Glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here too. We're going to talk today about intelligence, and specifically about entrepreneurial intelligence. That's our primary subject, but we're also going to talk about artificial intelligence. We'll explore it as a complement, but not a substitute for entrepreneurial intelligence. And you've been thinking deeply about this subject. You've been conducting a lot of research. You prepared a paper on this subject for the Austrian Economics Research Conference 2020, which was unfortunately postponed, but it may appear in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. So we'll look forward to that. But you can tell us some of the research that you've been doing today. So let's start at the beginning and tell us how you define entrepreneurial intelligence, Steve.
Yeah, sure. I think for a lot of people, entrepreneurial intelligence is about that spark, that aha or eureka moment, if you like, when the idea comes to somebody of a new business concept or idea. It's that moment of inspiration when you combine two disparate elements together. And you mentioned artificial intelligence, and there's a long-time critic of artificial intelligence by the name of Herbert Dreyfus, who said that humans are particularly unique and different from machines in the way that we can draw these elements together from the fringes of our consciousness to create new constructs. So that's one of the things that makes humans and entrepreneurs unique from machines. And human entrepreneurs also take risks, and so they invest their time and talent and treasure in their venture in the hope of a gain. And so in doing so, they stand to lose something of value to them. And so later on, we'll talk about how machines may not have that same element of risk-taking.
So you've mentioned a couple of concepts there, Steve. Cognition, about combining elements of knowledge or experience. Consciousness, you mentioned in the Dreyfus context. And we might say that taking risks is behavioral. So intelligence seems to be a combination of all of those things. Is that right?
Yeah, and particularly about that spark and that bringing things together.
So the spark sounds individual. That's something that an individual might have, that eureka moment. But we also talk about entrepreneurship as a force that drives the market. So is intelligence simply an attribute of individuals, or can it be part of a culture or a society, do you think?
I think at its heart, it's an individual act of intelligence, but that doesn't mean that the individual can't be influenced by the environment in which he or she finds themselves, and so you may have an example where you meet somebody who sparks that recognition for you. So somebody might be an expert in networks, and somebody else is with hardware, and together you see an opportunity for uh, networking hardware to get together just through a conversation and so forth. So that aha moment occurs internally to one person's head, but it doesn't mean that it can't be influenced by the encounters that you have with those around you. So a society that's focused on exploring opportunities, exploring ideas, and so forth is going to be much more open to that sort of thing happening.
There's also the relational part of entrepreneurial intelligence, Steve, isn't there? We talk a lot about empathic accuracy and understanding the subjective value that's experienced by another. So part of that entrepreneurial intelligence must be the interchange between individuals, not all in one individual's head.
I think you have to be able to recognize what's going on in other people's heads and determine what the needs are going to be and so forth. So in that sense, yes, that there requires there to be an exchange of understanding.
Okay. Steve Phelan and I are just now talking about empathic accuracy as part of entrepreneurial intelligence, an exchange of understanding with others, knowing what's going on in their heads. We have a free ebook on the subject called Understanding the Mind of the Customer. Give us your email address and we'll send you a free copy and automatically sign you up for a forthcoming ebook from Professor Phelan to be published shortly. Go to e4epod.com/mind. That's the letter E, number 4, letter E, pod.com/MIND. Now back to our conversation. So let's flip over to artificial intelligence, and we'll see what kind of comparisons we can make. So we think of artificial intelligence as, in one way, for an entrepreneur, a kind of capital resource. It's a new tool. It's an augmentation. Some people talk about it as a possible replacement for some human jobs. You start in your paper by pointing out there's a big difference between narrow and general forms of artificial intelligence. So let's first explain those two terms, will you please?
Sure, no problem. So narrow artificial intelligence or narrow AI is a form of software that can solve problems in a single domain. So a lot of the listeners will be familiar with Nest thermostats, so-called smart thermostats that can raise or lower a temperature according to a preset rule. So they have an if this, then that type rule. And if those rules are triggered, if the condition is triggered, it will take a certain action. General artificial intelligence, or general AI, on the other hand, is the ability to solve an unstructured or novel problem in a way that a human might do. So it's taking something where you don't know what the conditions are or the actions that are required and working something out. So it's actually very different from narrow AI.
And is it assumed in general AI that all of the human capabilities will be simulated or included, like the empathy that we talked about, and you talked about the fringes of consciousness? Is that assumed that AI will get to those kinds of states?
And there's a lot of debate in the field about exactly what you need, the components or the subcomponents, if you like, in order to simulate human intelligence. Initially, people started out in the 1960s assuming that you could just have the cognitive or rational parts of the brain and that the emotional and empathetic sides weren't required. Dreyfus, who we mentioned earlier, was a big critic of that and said that's not going to lead to anything. And I think scientists in the field are coming around to the view that Dreyfus, who was a philosopher, might actually be right, and we're starting to see more movement in that direction of looking at other aspects of human experience in order to generate general AI.
But it's assumed that that's a possibility at some indeterminate point in the future.
Well, yeah, people are very optimistic about this ability to create general artificial intelligence. The predictions keep getting pushed out. It always seems to be 20 years away. It's always 20 years from where we're at. In the 1960s, they were predicting that we would have it in the 1980s. That didn't happen. We've similarly got optimists predicting it now. But there are real problems with making that happen that we can go into a bit later, perhaps.
Okay. Let's nail down one other piece of terminology, Steve, before we go there, and that's machine learning. We hear that a lot, and is that a form of narrow artificial intelligence, kind of a subset? Tell us about machine learning.
Yeah, so machine learning is sort of taking it to the next level for narrow artificial intelligence. So if we think of that Nest thermostat that we mentioned earlier, following these reactive rules, if this condition, then do this action, what a machine learning capable machine will do is that it will start tracking behavior, tracking your habits, if you like, so it can learn to create its own rules about what settings you prefer. So it might start monitoring when you leave for work and when you come home again and so forth. So it might raise the temperature after you leave for work on weekdays, and then it may switch the heat back on when it knows you're about to come home. So it's using patterns in the data to predict what your preferences are. And so essentially it's mining that data, if you like, in order to make predictions about how to satisfy your needs.
And pattern recognition is an intelligent act, right? That's something that humans do a lot.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Well, let's move to how artificial intelligence can help entrepreneurs. That's what we try to do here at Economics for Entrepreneurs. And maybe we can start with machine learning. There have been a lot of applications of machine learning. How should an entrepreneur in any kind of business best approach machine learning to say, here's how this can help me?
Yeah, so everyone's very excited about machine learning, and one of the reasons is we live in a world that's awash with data right now. So every time we interact with a digital machine, it's collecting data on us, it seems. Google searches all the way through to Facebook, through to anything we're buying online. And so that data is creating information for data scientists to mine for patterns. And so a good example of that is Pandora, which is a music selection software, and it uses your song history to recommend other songs you might like. So it does this by matching song attributes in its database, and it looks at the songs you've listened to and comes up with songs with similar attributes. So it's doing this fairly complicated pattern matching that maybe a human might not have recognized. And it's able to do this very quickly and consider millions of cases at the same time. So anytime you have data that can be used for that sort of pattern matching, you can create a recommendation engine, for example. And we see this all the time. Amazon does it with shopping. You see it with streaming services for videos and so forth.
And we encourage entrepreneurs to think like that you can't observe human motivations when you're trying to understand the preferences of customers, but behavior, if you study it and observe it, reveals preferences. And we said, I think in an earlier edition, that motivation is embedded in behavior. So if you can study the behavior, you can deduce the motivation. So this is augmentation, right? This is artificial intelligence doing what we tell entrepreneurs they should be doing.
Right. And really helping out with that pattern recognition, yes.
Okay. So anytime pattern recognition can help reveal motivations, we should try to use machine learning if we've got enough data.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So then let's go to the artificial narrow intelligence beyond just machine learning. What other ways can ANI, let's call it, artificial narrow intelligence, help entrepreneurs?
So another application beyond just recommendations and looking for patterns is actually to train the AI to deal with novel situations. So We've seen a lot of attention lately on self-driving vehicles or autonomous vehicles, where the data scientists are using a combination of historical vehicle experiences and simulated data in order to find reactions for situations that a vehicle might find itself in. So obviously the computer can watch humans drive around, but there's going to be a lot of situations that you just can't capture with humans on video, and it may require a lot of human interaction to generate a good amount of data that's going to help the computer in every situation. So as you can sense, this is going to require mountains of data. So what scientists have started doing is creating simulations where the computer can run a simulated car driving test and do this millions of different scenarios, millions of different times a day, and learn the best way to respond. So the computer then builds a set of rules for the various situations that it encounters. And so this is very similar to the way that computers are being taught to beat humans at chess. You may have remembered a few years ago that the world chess champion was beaten by a computer. And computers are now getting more and more complex and able to handle more complicated things. And so now they're beating online game players, for instance, in very complicated online games. And they do this by looking at historical data, but also by running simulations and finding new ways of doing things that humans may not have experienced at all.
I've heard the expression, Steve, of training an AI by using data sets, or lots of open data sets that people can go to that are big enough to generate this kind of machine learning or adaptive learning. Is training your AI, is that a meaningful expression? Is that the right image to come up with?
Yeah, so a lot of these algorithms, the way you typically approach this is you may divide your data set into two if you have historical data. So you train it on the first half of the data, and then you give it the second half of the data to see how well the predictions match up with what really happened. And so that way you can test the accuracy of your algorithm that you've developed. And so you have a training data set, and then you have this other test set that you use to see how things are working. And so obviously it's very dependent on whether you have a broad sampling of the phenomenon of interest. If everything's only focused on summer days, for example, your AI is not going to deal very well with winter conditions. And so it's very important that you're sampling from the correct set of data. And that's probably one of the bigger challenges in the field.
But conceptually, if an entrepreneur wanted or felt like there was a training regimen that he or she could put some data through to find out whether their instinct was right, that's possible to do. You can go find the right data set, you can split it in two, you can train the AI on one half and then see what happens with the second half. That's something that many of us could do. Is that right?
Well, it's interesting. There's a lot of debates around that in the field right now. So, for example, the companies with the bigger data sets are the ones like Google and Amazon that have all the traffic on their websites. So some people have called for a liberalisation of data, for example, that should be available to anyone who wants to access those patterns and maybe strip the data of its identifying features, but just give the patterns and let people determine what's going on there rather than leave it up to large corporations or governments in that case to own that data or control it. So, it's a problem to get access to sufficient amounts of data. And so solving that problem would be something that an entrepreneur would have to overcome. Simulation then is one way to overcome that, but once again, it comes down to the fidelity of the simulation. And so the more time and money you spend building a simulation that's accurate and accurately maps the real world, the better those simulations are going to be. And the more accurate they'll be able to train those AIs. And so once again, it's a matter of resources about whether there are off-the-shelf simulations there or whether they're proprietary. And so I can see a market developing for people providing those sort of off-the-shelf simulations for different applications.
Yeah, I know secondhand that IBM has done a lot of work in the area of open data sets. They've made them available to researchers at universities and other experimenters. I would guess that they want them to use their Watson AI to help analyze it. But generalizing from that, I think there are people providing those open data sets and those experimental environments where you can do those simulations. So a little
Absolutely.
investigation would make that clear, I think. So let's go to the next point in your paper, Steve, which is that there's a huge gulf between what we've called artificial narrow intelligence and what you briefly referred to earlier as artificial general intelligence. And maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, I can't remember, but you said it'll never be a replacement for entrepreneurial intelligence. So let's dig into artificial general intelligence a little bit more, and how will it develop?
Sure. So I think just from our discussion so far of machine learning and narrow intelligence, I think the listeners will start to realize that it requires you to know what the inputs are. It requires that you can collect them. It requires that you know what the relevant responses are and the payoffs for given responses. So think about a chess playing computer, for example. You know that there are 64 squares on a chessboard, that there's different types of pieces, that the goal is to capture the king and so forth. And the closer you get to that goal, the higher the payoff. And so all of this stuff is given to a computer when it starts to play chess. And so it knows what legal moves are, what aren't legal moves, what pieces can do, what they can't do. Now, in an unstructured situation, none of that is taken for granted. So you don't know what's relevant, what to focus on, what's important. And so a naive view would just be say, well, let the computer have everything and let it work it all out. And so, but just reflecting on that for a moment, you realize that now we're talking about millions, if not trillions, of pieces of data or pieces of information. And so if you're a computer, it's not obvious that the oxygen atom that's floating in front of you at 2.3 meters isn't important to solving the problem. And we think that's ridiculous as humans. We think it's clearly not relevant, but we just take for granted that we filter those things out and that we focus on the things that are important. And it turns out that this is a very human trait, this uncanny ability to focus on what's important in a situation, to extrapolate from our past experiences, to create a novel solution, to draw on our depths of experience from a wide range of different experiences and domains of knowledge to try and piece together a solution. And so a computer, unless you tell it what to focus on and what's important, really has no idea how to do something like that. So a lot of the time, those things that are important are provided to it by human programmers, and they're known as hyperparameters in the field. So you're told, focus on these types of moves. Look at these opening moves in chess. Look at the way that this board is set up. Look at the past strategies of other chess masters and so forth. But a truly intelligent computer would have to be able to figure out what was important in a situation just by itself. And so arguably we're light years from that happening. Part of the problem is that it requires a theory of mind, and a theory of mind is a philosophical idea of understanding how another entity that's sentient, like a human being, thinks. What are their motivations and so forth, what makes them tick. And so there's a well-known entrepreneurship researcher, Jeff McMullen, who has a theory that entrepreneurs need empathic accuracy to anticipate the needs of customers. And that's a great example of a theory of mind. If you're designing a product that someone else is going to buy, you have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of that person and sort of experience that buying process, if you like, and how they're going to enjoy what you're offering. So a sentient computer, a computer that's truly got an entrepreneurial intelligence, would have to have that ability to understand what it's like to be a human, and what motivates them and what excites them and what scares them and all of those different emotions. And as we mentioned also about this notion of consciousness, maybe a computer is also going to need to be self-aware in order to truly empathize with others. So how do you prioritize decisions if you have no survival instinct, for example? And so of course, if a computer does have a survival instinct, that terrifies people because they see images of Terminator or something like that. There's plenty of sci-fi stories about computers putting themselves ahead of humans. But on a different level, though, if you're going to make entrepreneurial judgments, you're going to have to choose between what's more or less risky for your particular situation, your set of values. And so if you don't have a set of values, it's impossible to decide if one decision is better than another. And right now, human programmers are providing those values and those priorities to computers. They're not doing it themselves.
Well, there's some question about whether even humans can have that theory of mind in any general sense. The famous Thomas Nagel paper about what's it like to be a bat, and the human being can't empathize with what it's like to be a bat,
Right.
and so a computer could never empathize with what it's like to be a human. That would be a parallel that you might try to draw.
Right. It's an interesting philosophical question about can you empathize with another entity if you're not of that type?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But the empathic accuracy that McMullen talks about, in one of his papers, he equated that to judgment. He says entrepreneurial judgment is, in fact, empathic accuracy. Is that a good way to think about it?
Well, to some degree, because a judgment is a sort of bet, if you like, that you have it right. And so, so being able to put yourself in someone's shoes and being confident that the reaction that you think they're going to make is going to be accurate is a judgment of sorts. Yeah.
Okay. So we're questioning whether this kind of intelligence, entrepreneurial intelligence, is available to AGI at any point in time. But let's drill into the intelligence for entrepreneurs a little bit. When we talk about that in casual conversation, let's say, it tends to be implied that it's unevenly distributed. Some groups in a population might be more intelligent than others in some way. And then lately, commentators have started to delve into special instances of intelligence. So emotional intelligence was a popular theme for a while. It's applicable in special situations of human interaction, as opposed to mathematical intelligence about numbers and symbols. So there may be different types of intelligence, and entrepreneurial intelligence is just one of them?
Yeah, I think entrepreneurial intelligence is probably a combination of different types of intelligence. Howard Gardner, a psychologist, was the first to suggest that there are multiple intelligences back in 1984. His list included math intelligence, language, spatial, musical intelligence, social intelligence, and so forth. So we know that the intelligence quotient, or IQ, has always been a strong predictor of job performance. But recently, emotional intelligence, or EQ, has also been found to be a strong predictor of on-the-job performance, as well as curiosity intelligence, something that's just come on the scene in the last couple of years. CQ, curiosity quotient,
Okay.
also been found to be a strong predictor of performance. So I would argue that people with high EQs, emotional quotients, probably find it easier to be empathic. That's one of the facets of that measure of whether you understand others and their motivations. And I think that curiosity quotient is closely linked to creativity. So that finding of solutions by combining different elements on the fringes of consciousness, as Dreyfus put it. So in both those dimensions, the curiosity and the emotional, I think machines are really bad at that stuff because they've got that, once again, no way of determining what's relevant unless someone tells them.
So maybe this is a hypothetical question I couldn't ask, but or shouldn't ask, but artificial general intelligence, could researchers possibly break that down into some of these different subsets and train an artificial intelligence on one of them? For example, curiosity. You might be able to mechanize that in some kind of way to make a machine curious. Could we train it on one of these subsets?
Certainly, there are people that are trying to do that and figuring out the best way of doing it. Dreyfus, in his criticisms way back in the 1960s, said that it's once again, it's a category problem. If you're combining things together, what things should be combined together of all the millions of possible things that a machine could be paying attention to? Which ones are the relevant ones? And once again, we humans have this ability to draw things out of the recesses of our mind that don't seem relevant at the time, and then all of a sudden our mind activates that. And so that's one of the problems. And then bringing things together in partial categories and creating new categories that didn't exist before. I think I mentioned trains were referred to as iron horses in some cultures, and so they're combining the concept of a horse with the concept of metal, and only over time did that become a separate construct in its own right. So humans have this ability to create these new concepts and new words as well out of pre-existing categories, and therefore create new categories. And so it's not just a matter of the computer just randomly throwing different things together. It also has to have this ability to associate things that are distant in a sort of semantic sense, and also to create those new categories. And it has to do that as well in an economic way, because you can't go and combine millions of different possibilities and test them out in a physical sense, because the costs would be prohibitive. So one of the issue and probably one of the advantages of the market process is that entrepreneurs have an incentive to economize. They have limited resources, and they have an incentive to get it right. So they're not just randomly combining things together and throwing stuff against the wall. They're doing it in a very intelligent way, because they realize that they don't get a lot of attempts at it. And computers not valuing resources in that sense don't have the same imperatives. And so that would obviously be something you'd have to build into the computer to have those values, the ability to reach into the recesses and associate things at a distance, and also to create new categories. So once you start adding all these things up, they all become very big challenges. And so, yes, while it's possible to maybe create these subsets, creating the whole that generates things in a human-like way is quite difficult.
Well, given that researchers have spent all this effort in thinking about intelligence for machines and training machines and so on like that, can business owners use some of that knowledge and assess their own entrepreneurial intelligence and maybe train themselves and polish themselves? What do you think about self-assessing for entrepreneurial intelligence?
There's been a lot of attempts over the years to come up with instruments to do that. One of the more interesting ones was developed by a life insurance company that was trying to measure people's risks and whether they're entrepreneurial, and they developed something called an entrepreneurial quotient, or EQ. And some research showed it was the best predictor of whether somebody would start a business or not. So it focuses on family of origin, some behavioral traits and so forth. It's not particularly scientific, but for some reason it honed in on the factors that led people to start businesses. On a more psychological level, there are other measures that try and measure psychological traits. There's another one that measures individual entrepreneurial orientation. Seems to show some promise. But generally, the research has shown a weak correlation between personality traits and entrepreneurial behavior. So it seems to come down more to behaviors rather than something innate in the personality. Maybe there are habits that can be learned. Maybe things are learned at a young age. So the jury is still out on that one, but definitely there's a lot of tools out there that can be used to at least rate yourself.
Yeah, I looked at that individual entrepreneurial orientation assessment, and we can link to that, I think, in the show notes. It talks about entrepreneurial passion and perseverance, which doesn't sound like the same thing as intelligence. If any of our listeners want to go look at a self-assessment that we attempted, it's at hunterhastings.com/self, and it looks at attributes like self-reliance, the ability to be a self-starter, self-augmentation, the ability to use some of these interconnected resources, including possibly artificial intelligence, and then a customer orientation, the empathy and the co-creation that we talk about. I know you looked at that briefly, Steve, and you said good, but it lacks the psychological metrics. So maybe we've got a little bit more work to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a matter of going out and getting some samples and seeing if it predicts the things it should predict, and whether the things hang together in the way they should hang together.
Yeah. So another intelligence, entrepreneurial intelligence, that entrepreneurs might want to assess is that of employees.
Mm-hmm.
I may want to employ someone to whom we delegate derived judgment, as the literature calls it. People help us making entrepreneurial decisions, or even potential business partners. So presumably, if you can assess yourself, you can assess others through that same lens. Is that a useful channel to go down?
I think it can be useful, and I think your listeners will recognize that organizations have relied on psychometric testing for many years. In fact, I think the US Army was the progenitor of the IQ test for placing people for military service in the First World War, and the French under Binet also doing it for schooling. So it's definitely been used for classification in the past, and so there's still a role there to do that. Personally, I maintain that the best predictor of future success is past success. Obviously, there are no guarantees with any particular context. So, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, I prefer to build trust over time through small demonstrations of ability before making large commitments to someone. Oftentimes, that's not an option, but where it is, I think that's a safe route to go. I think even Brian Kaplan made the point in his book about education that a lot of credentials in education exist as signals of somebody's conscientiousness or persistence, if you like, that ability to get something, see something through to completion, like a degree, and a sort of a base IQ test. If you have a degree from Harvard or something, you have to have some sort of a level of ability and ability to complete tasks, and so even things like credentials from universities can serve as a screening device in that sense.
So, where I'm trying to drive us to, Steve, is whether entrepreneurs can use those assessment techniques to assess the usefulness of artificial intelligence in terms of how it would best support their own entrepreneurial intelligence. So, without making any guesses about the future of artificial general intelligence, let me assess how it can help me today to make better decisions, to supplement my judgment. Do you think entrepreneurs in their own individual businesses and situations could make that assessment?
I think they could. I think that they do it in exactly the same way as I suggest that they approach employees, and that's just test it out. And there's a lot of these algorithms now being made publicly available. There's a lot of companies springing up that are offering to implement AI-based solutions with your particular set of data. I know at the university we've had companies approaching us about enrollment and retention type data, and let us run it through our AI algorithm and uncover patterns that you may not have seen before. And my approach to that has always been experimental, and it's just like, if you can show that it works with some small subset of the data on a small trial, then I think that's the way to approach it. Is start with a small investment, see if it works, then make a larger commitment. So definitely I would encourage action, try these things out, try and talk to people who are trying it in your field and get ahead of the curve. But also realize that these things don't always work as advertised, just like anything, I guess, any fad that you see in business. There's some truth to it, and there's also some people that are overselling it and overhyping it. And I think the solution to that is just to try a small experiment and see if it works for your particular context.
I remember a few years ago being in a debate about whether artificial intelligence, or we just thought about it as software back then, can have agency, whether it can act. And we're talking about it in the context of service, so digital service provision.
Mm-hmm.
And the nest example, the whole if this then that kind of construct is agency. The software can do something that serves you. So we've come a long way since debating whether that was possible. We've talked about entrepreneurial judgment, which is action in a sense. It's making a bet. You said earlier on. Can today's AI have judgment? Can it perform that function for entrepreneurs?
I think the answer is absolutely yes, because most AIs are designed to give a result. So a recommendation, as we mentioned before, is just a judgment of what you or a customer is going to like, for instance. We have expert systems that are going to look at a set of symptoms and then make a recommendation on what it thinks the disease is, and actually go and diagnose a disease. And if you let it, it'll go ahead and give you the appropriate treatment for that disease. Banks are using AI to predict credit risk, for instance, and they take all of the data on a company's financial situation and then try and predict if it's going to go bankrupt or not. But in all of these cases, it's dependent on the quality of the system, and in some cases, garbage in, garbage out, right? So you still need what Foss and Klein call original judgment or meta judgment to decide if the AI is still worth using. So that's why totally self-driving cars scare me, because they're going to break whenever they encounter a situation they've not been trained to handle. And in the literature, these are known as edge cases, or special cases, if you like. So, so a bicyclist, you may recall, was killed in March 2018 when an Uber self-driving car didn't recognize the input. Of course, it didn't help that the human driver was playing on her phone, and the auto braking had been disabled. So these things are fallible. They're not perfect. They're not super intelligent. They do some things better than humans. They're faster. They're more accurate in a lot of cases. But they're very dependent on the model that they've built internally. And those models can be wrong. They can be fooled. There are cases in image recognition where you can spoof the computer to make it think that the image is something completely different. And so at the end of the day, it's only going to be up to that final human judgment to decide if you're going to deploy the AI in the situation that you're interested in. And so knowing how fallible these things are, it just makes me nervous that you would completely put it in charge of driving a car, or, as we remember in war games back in the 80s, they're putting in charge of the nuclear arsenal or something like that.
Yeah, scary stuff. Well, let's see if we can arrive at a bottom line of some kind, Steve, in terms of advice for entrepreneurs for utilizing AI. As we said at the outset, it's certainly potentially a tool. And we've stressed many times on this podcast that the code is available. A lot of it is on GitHub. If you're not a programmer yourself, there are plenty of programmers you can hire to make AI useful for you. So one question might be, well, what entrepreneurial function can I use its help in? So we talk about understanding customers, understanding their subjective values. We talk about capital allocation, getting your capital allocation right, so making the choices between resource X and resource Y, which you and I have talked about. Maybe it's modeling cash flows and margins and things like that. Maybe it's relationship management of some kind. If you are advising entrepreneurs, which you do, where are some of the places where you'd first look to apply what's available today in artificial intelligence?
Well, I think, as I alluded to earlier, the easiest way is through any sort of pattern recognition. And so if you have lots of data and you're seeking to uncover hidden patterns in there that may give you an edge over your competitors, that's certainly a place to look. I think my key piece of advice is that we're in an experimental phase right now, and I think you can throw a lot of things at the wall and see what sticks. But also recognizing the limitations of AI. So anything that generates a lot of data can be mined for patterns. And so obviously the machine learning can find patterns that humans can't see, but they're also very prone to finding spurious correlations and spurious patterns, and they can be very fragile in that sense. Another downside is these algorithms are often black boxes, which means that even the programmers can't easily explain why a particular decision is being made. So this has led some companies like Stitch Fix, for example, to use AI to recommend fashion choices for their customers, and then to have a fashion designer look at the recommendations and make the ultimate decision about what to send out to customers. So it's very much a hybrid of human and computer in that sense, but not allowing the computer to make the ultimate choice. And so as the level of risk goes up, some companies have decided that they want to have that human oversight, that fail-safe approach, if you like. But at the end of the day, that's also going to be a trade-off for some companies. So if you think about high volume stock market trading, maybe there's no time for a human to oversee what the computer's decision is, because the opportunity or the threat is milliseconds in time. But at the end of the day, someone's making a judgment to say, I'm happy to let the computer trade with these parameters. And hopefully after some of the experiences with computer trading, that they've built in some fail-safes and backstops in there as well. And fingers crossed that that's happening to the level we need it to.
Yeah.
So it's really taking it with a grain of salt, recognizing there are risks as well as rewards, and to adopt the appropriate trade-off, which is ultimately that original meta judgment that we discussed earlier.
Good. Well, Steve, thank you. I think the message is do lots of experiments, and we'll find out what works, as opposed to trying to be clear about what might happen in the future, which nobody knows. So thanks for this survey. We'll link to your paper and to a couple of other things you've mentioned. And we thank you for this tour d'horizon of artificial intelligence. Thanks for all of your advice.
No problem at all. My pleasure.
Thanks, Steve. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Economics for Entrepreneurs is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. That's MISES.org. For more from Hunter Hastings, check out hunterhastings.com.